How's everybody doing today? You're watching Slot Car Mayhem. I'm John, and this will be the 21st episode of the Glendale 65. And today we're going to continue the rabbit hole, and we're going to dive down and take a look at effectively lighting residential structures to get a more realistic appearance. If we put this in contrast to the last episode, episode 20, dealing with the commercial structures, we'll simply find that residential structures behave completely differently than commercial structures. Just a quick recap, some of the rules of commercial structures is very simple. The building should be illuminated regardless of time of day as long as the business is open for business. That makes perfect sense. And likewise, you may have multiple scenarios where things like road signs may come on. Generally, when it starts getting dark, any sort of security lighting, same thing. Those work generally dusk to dawn, and those things need to be factored in. But as a general rule, commercial buildings are always illuminated on the inside as long as the business is open without any regard for time of day. Now, today we're talking about residential. And the reason why I separate these out is residential structures actually behave completely differently from commercial. And that's why it's kind of important to bring these into the equation and to see what it is that we actually have. Okay, going back to some of the don'ts, all of the don'ts that we have for lighting our structures are just as applicable for the residential as they are for the commercial. Things like light leaks, glowing walls and windows, unrealistic lighting scenarios, all those type of things. One more thing I did not touch on, but as I was looking across on the web at certain other models that are available, one other thing we do want to avoid if you want to achieve a realistic look, and I've seen quite a few of them actually, and that would be structures with frosted windows. And as soon as I saw those, I thought to myself, why are they doing this? So if you find a structure that you like and you want to use it and it has frosted windows, go ahead and pull the windows out and replace them with either clear plastic or if you can find a good deal on them, something that is really good to use actually if you want to replace the windows in your structures, and that would be microscope slides. Usually you can get a box of 100 of them for relatively cheap. They're thin, they're small, they're easy to cut if you need to cut them, and they provide the perfect look. So that's always a good little tip. Here you go. Microscope slides work really well in this application. Okay, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to pull my screen up over here and we'll take a look at some pictures, much like we did with the commercial, and we'll take a look at a couple residential structures. And you'll see what I'm referring to about maybe how we want to light things, what we see, what we may want to do differently, and we'll move on from there. All right, let's take a look at this first picture here. And I like this picture. It shows quite a bit of things here. It's actually a pretty cool looking house. I love the 3-car garage. To me, that just tells me everything I need to know right there. But let's take a look at the picture for what it is as a whole. We can see it's a very well lit structure. We have exterior lighting on the pillars here. We've got some landscape lighting floating around out here. And we just generally take a look at the structure. And this is the way you're going to find a lot of residential structures on a model railroad or something like that actually being illuminated. Let's dig in a little bit and see exactly what we have. If we start looking inside the building itself, I really don't see anything at all inside the building here. This house looks completely empty. Up in this room over here, and even in here, if you notice, we've got shelves and those are completely empty. So what that's telling me is this house is vacant. It's probably a picture from a realtor and they're showing the house off. But right now, all I can do is think back to when I was a kid and I could hear my parents screaming at me, "Why is every light on the house on?" And that's exactly what we see here. The whole thing is completely illuminated. The garage, every room in the house is on. It's all bright and cheery and happy. But something about it just doesn't look right. There's no life, even though we have this overly lit structure here. So this can be an issue. And that's something we need to be very mindful of when we're doing residential structures, is we don't want to overlight them. And I don't mean by brightness, but I mean light up the entire house It just doesn't look quite right. Now, that being said, in this case here, you could pass this off as a very respectable scene simply by having maybe 2 figures in this window, a couple figures up on the balcony, maybe one off over here, several out in the yard, and have 3 cars maybe in the driveway and another 3 or 4 out in the front of the street. Now they're having a house party. Now it makes sense. But in this case here, the way this picture looks, it just doesn't look right to my eye. It looks empty and vacant, and it looks exactly what it is that a realtor is showing off the house. So we need to be careful when we're lighting our structures, especially our residential, to avoid making it look too busy. Commercial, we want them to look busy. Residential, we don't. We want them to look more relaxed. Another thing to pay attention to, if we notice, if we look in the contrast between this window and this window and this window, we're actually seeing 3 different colors of lighting right here up on top. And that's because this area here is actually illuminated. It looks like it's bleed over into this room here or area that the light has just bled into. But this looks like it might be lit with more of a fluorescent style of lighting. Same thing with the garage. We can see it's lit with a cooler white than the rest of the house, indicating the garage is fluorescent and these are incandescent. So don't be afraid to vary the color temperature of your lighting where you feel it's necessary to help achieve a little variance in how things look. Let's take a look at another thing here, and this will kind of reinforce what I'm talking about when maybe you're overdriving and overly illuminating a residential structure and everything is all lit up. Let's look next door over here. You can clearly see this window is off, and this doorway over here, there's no illumination coming out of there either. Is this building currently occupied? I don't know, but it would make reasonable sense if this here was say a utility room with a side access into the house, and this here was maybe a restroom right above the utility room. Neither one of them are occupied, so the lights are off. Makes perfect sense. And if we go over on the other side, and the picture might be a little dark to see, we can see we have a portion of the house lit here, but the other side off over here is not illuminated, indicating that, you know, people at night are just occupying this section of the house and the rest of the lights are off. So one thing we do need to be careful is make sure we're not lighting every single room in our residential structures. And that can really go a long way to help enhance realism, because actually it's what we happen to see every single day. Okay, let's take a look at this picture over here, and this picture actually better represents what you would actually see in lighting a residential structure. I love the picture. I think it's an adorable picture, and that's why I grabbed it. I think it's just a real artsy, real classy picture here, and you've got some good ideas. We notice, again, we have our landscape lighting, but it's not terribly bright. And if you're going to do landscape lighting or exterior lighting on your residential structures, keep them subdued and at a minimum. If you want to have a decorative light pole in the front of the house, that's fine. If you want to have 1 or 2 security lights on the house, that's fine too, but keep them at a minimum. You'll be better off for it, and it gives you a better look, and it will give you a better sense of size and spreading out the your scene and making your scene look bigger if you don't have too much lighting going on with residential. Let's take a look at the structure itself and see what we have. First thing, we can clearly see that these 2 lights upstairs here are off. Very important. This light here is very interesting because I'm imagining maybe a stairwell coming up inside the structure, and this is simple bleed over from the lighting that's on downstairs. It looks like we have living room lighting, foyer lighting, and maybe dining room or kitchen lighting right here. And we have 1 little security light right here. And that's it. But this very well represents how you would actually see illumination of a residential structure at night. So making sure that you partition off any walls that you need to partition off and maybe making some openings so you can capture this type of effect here can be very beneficial and really enhance the look of illuminating a residential structure for nighttime scenes. Okay, let's go over some of the major differences in between lighting a commercial structure and a residential structure. Number one, like I said earlier, commercial structures are illuminated as long as the business is open with no regard to time of day whatsoever. Residential structures differ greatly in the fact that under normal conditions during daylight hours, you're not going to illuminate the structure at all. That takes away a lot of headaches too, making residential structures very easy to illuminate. So that's something to be, you want to make sure that you do incorporate. You don't want to have all your houses lit up during the day because that's not how you normally see things, and that's not what we're going to do. The second thing is when the residential lighting starts turning on, and I like to stagger them and have them come on in, you know, one here, one there, one there, one there. I don't like to have them all come on at once. But by doing so, when you start turning on your residential lighting, you want to do it much earlier in the day-night cycle than you would normally do for, say, turning on the road signs of a commercial business. And the reason why is twofold. Number one, generally the lights are off inside the structure during the day. So you're going to be turning them on when it starts getting dark out, right? We do this all the time. And also something that a lot of people don't always directly think about is more often than not, residential structures are going to be in areas with trees, and that's actually going to make the horizon, I guess, or the sunset event actually start to occur earlier. And people do tend to start turning on their lights inside their house much earlier in the day than, say, a residential structure or a commercial structure. So you want to start bringing on these lights earlier in your day-night cycle, and that'll really help increase that realism. And also you can have a nicely lit structure by the time your sunsets are occurring, and it looks really good. So make sure you start turning on your interior lighting for your residential structures earlier in the game than you would for any secondary or auxiliary lighting for your commercial structures. That goes a long way to help achieve the effect you're after. Another thing, like I said, we don't want to overlight the structure and light up every room. We do want to partition them off. At some point in the time, when I'm looking at my layout here and what I've done with model railroading in the past, and I'm considering dynamic lighting, and the light's going to shift from daytime through evening, sunset, all the way through the night, eventually come back up to you know, sunrise, daylight, and go all the way around the horn like that. And when you're using lighting, overhead lighting, to indicate the passage of time, what you're doing with your residential structures also need to indicate the passage of time. This is where they become very important, and you can really tell the time of day by what you're doing with your residential structures. At some point in time, the people living in those structures, they're eventually going to go to bed, right? So what happens? You start turning off the lights inside your house, everything's dark. If you have some decorative light poles or a security light or something like that, you can leave those on dusk to dawn, but the interior lighting should eventually, sometime through the middle of the night, begin to go off, and that would indicate people actually going to bed. Now, I will tell you, model railroading, I always had a big laugh because I've done the dynamic lighting before and things of this nature before on layouts, and it's actually funny. I remember under quite a few, enough that it wasn't a coincidence, we'd be doing some long operating sessions, and you know, everything's going on and people are doing what they're doing, and model railroading is much slower than slot cars. Slot cars, you're focused on driving the car and that's it. Model railroading, no, you're waiting for a train to get from here and going through there nice and slow through the scenery, so you pay attention to a lot more. And some of these long operating sessions, it would get to the point where, you know, all of a sudden now houses are blinking out as people are going to bed, and people don't really notice it directly, But I guarantee you, too many times for it to be a coincidence, it would turn into a yawn fest all of a sudden. People would start, yawning like they're getting tired. And here it is 7 o'clock at night, and they're yawning because in their mindset, they're thinking it's a lot later than it actually is. People are going to bed, I'm staying up late, I'm getting tired. So it was a great psychological thing that I've seen happen on more than one occasion, and it made life a whole lot of fun. So, but that generates a really good, solid, realistic feel, especially for your spectators. If you're going to be doing residential structures on your slot car layout, for your spectators, I guarantee you they're going to love it. And does a great little trick there. Unfortunately, I'm not going to have any residential structures on my layout. I don't feel like I have the room or the place for them. But, and that I'm kind of sad about, because that's actually my favorite part, is doing residential, because you can bring so much life into a scene with very simple automation, and it really can just overall increase the realism tremendously. So if you have the opportunity to do residential structures, by all means, go ahead and incorporate them. And a lot of these little effects and tricks we're going to talk about can really greatly enhance the realism of what's going on and the general feel. So always keep that in mind. At some point in time, people are going to have to go to bed. You want to make sure you capture that. Another thing, talking about lighting effects, I like to do. Again, I'm very funny about using lighting effects. I like to have them simple, spaced apart, and not very many at all. But you can mix up different types of lighting effects and kind of group them together, not all in the same structure, but in the same neighborhood, if you will. And that will generally give you a really good look that can really bring a lot of life to an otherwise completely dead scene. And so let's talk about some of those lighting effects. One of them I like to do and put into a structure would be, they make little circuits with an RGB LED that you can put into a room, one room only, and it should be blocked off, of course. And that would give you the indication of a television being on in that room. We all know what we're all thinking of what that looks like already in our heads, and that's exactly the look it gives you. And especially if you have maybe some curtains in that room and you've got that indication of a television being on the room, it's a fantastic effect. Just, you may want to make sure, depending what room it is, that you turn that off before people start going to bed, right? Got to be mindful of your effects and how you're implementing them. Another really good effect I like to do, and I've never seen a circuit for it, but I just made my own. It wasn't a big deal. And I would take one corner of one residential structure only, and I would have one corner blocked off. Depending on the view and how it's sitting, it's one window, maybe two, depending how it's sitting. And that room will just remain dark. And it's most effective throughout the middle of the night scenario where people are asleep. And that light would just come on for 15 seconds or so and then turn off. And that's an absolute indication that somebody got up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. Perfect. Great lighting effect, and it usually only has to happen once in an overnight scene, and it just really brings a lot of life into an otherwise dead scene. So it's really effective to do that, and you don't always catch it, and that's the point. It's not an effect that you're going to go, wow, everybody jumps in and notices. You catch it once in a while, maybe out of the corner of your eye, and you just ignore it because it's normal. And we all understand it immediately when we see it, and that's what we're trying to do. Another effect that I really like, and it's a little bit more complex, but I'll usually trigger it with a sound module as well. And I will have one security light somewhere in a building, and middle of the night scene, again, very effective, and just have a sound module with the sound of a dog barking in the distance. And then maybe a second or two later, have that one security light come on for 10 seconds or so and then turn off. And very simple, but what does that tell you? Well, a dog sensed a deer, barked at it, deer took off and ran, set off somebody's security light. Again, we're bringing a tremendous amount of life into an otherwise dead scene at night while everybody's asleep. So there's a lot of opportunity for doing things like this. Again, you've got to be careful not to overdo them. Usually 1 or 2 occurrences through an overnight scene is plenty. Okay, another thing that we do want to talk about as far as building a scene for residential structures is we do need to be careful about what we're doing with certain elements, especially if you're going to be using a dynamic day-night type of scenario. And you really don't want to have a lot of activity going on that would look out of place for certain times of day. I've seen, lots of scenes where somebody out mowing the grass, and that's a great look. It's a great, beautiful look, actually. You need to be careful though, because as you start going into a night scene, that's going to look completely out of place. Somebody's not going to be out there at 2 o'clock in the morning mowing the lawn, right? So those are the kind of things we need to look at. Some further good ideas if you want to build some additional life into a scene is if you have a garage like we showed in one of the structures, or a standoff garage, go ahead and illuminate the structure and use fluorescent lighting. It's going to contrast greatly with what you see in the rest of the structure. And maybe have the doors open, a car half in and out, maybe some people working on the car or something. That can be a good scene, but again, be careful how that scene is going to present itself in an overnight scenario. We need to be very mindful about what we're doing with our effects and how we're setting up our scenes so we can accommodate for day and night scenarios and all the way around the 24-hour clock, and make sure we're not going to build something in that's out of place. Okay, we'll go ahead and we'll wrap this episode up and keep it kind of short. And if you haven't done so, please just hit that subscribe button, get those notifications, because we're going to have a lot of content coming up here. The bridge section I've got to do, that's all going to be scratch built, as well as most of my structures are going to be scratch built, so we got to do all that. The backlighting will be coming in as soon as I get the infill outfill finished, and I know I've promised some videos for you for actually doing the cutting for the infill outfill, and I'll get to those just as soon as I get my router parts in so I can get back to doing infill and outfill. Broke a couple things on my router. I need to get those fixed. So those are on their way in now, so that should be coming up soon. Okay, back to the residential lighting. It's pretty simple overall. Don't be afraid to experiment with your residential lighting. Just remember, be careful of the same laws that we always work with. No light leaks, glowing walls, hot spots, direct visibility of the bulb, things like that. If you have frosted windows, get rid of them. Put microscope slides or clear plastic in their place. You'll be much better off for it. Be careful about lighting up every single room in the structure. Don't light up the whole structure. You want to partition off some areas so you can get a little bit of natural bleed over into one room and completely block the light from another. Really good look, and it better emulates what we see if we drive around our neighborhood at night. So if you got any questions on that, don't be afraid to drive around your block at night and take a look at what you actually see. And you might be surprised how easy it is to actually implement a realistic residential building scene. One more important thing, I always like to abide by the rule of odds. And what I mean by that, residential structures, I try to group them in 3s. 5s are better than 3 for structures. Have maybe 5 houses and that's it. You don't want 6, you don't want 4, you don't want 2. It just looks out of place. So always try to group things in odd numbers if you can. 5 structures is generally good. 5, 7, 9 is usually a good amount. 3 starts to look a little odd, but try to keep them 5, and try to keep your effects, if you can, not on the ends and not in the direct middle. Try to keep them randomized somewhere. That's why I like to use 5 and not 3, because I can do number 2 and 4 for an effect and it looks good. If you do 1, 3, or 5, it's going to look kind of out of place. So always avoid the middle and the ends if you can for doing any sort of effects. It does go a very long way into helping the realistic and the randomness of these effects fall into place. So okay, we'll wrap this up, and again, if you guys have anything, any questions, comments, anything, please just hit me up. I'll be happy to answer anything I can. And as always, thanks for the subscriptions. Thank you for all the comments and everything. They do mean a lot to me. I want everybody to stay safe and just make sure you and your family are well protected. Take care of you Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.